Greetings to the gods, and we're continuing Webster's World History chronology, early modern period 1492 to 1814. For events affecting any one country only, or especially, see the history of that country in the National Histories beginning on page 59. Era of the Renaissance and Reformation or Reformation. 1492. Christopher Columbus, leading an expedition under the auspices of Ferdinand and Isabella, reaches America. October 12, discovering Hispaniola and Cuba. On his second voyage, made in 1493, he discovers Puerto Rico, and on his third voyage in 1498, he reaches Trinidad and the coast of South America. From Hispaniola, he is sent back to Spain in chains, 1501, but is allowed his liberty and makes his fourth and last voyage in 1502. Columbus dies in neglect and penury at Valladolid, May 20th, 1506. In 1493, Charles VIII of France makes a treaty of peace with Maximilian, just become Emperor of Germany at, at Senils. Maximilian attempts to reform the empire and institutes the Antilles Council of 1501. In 1494, the Medici are driven from Florence, and Savonarola, the Italian reformer, restores the republican form of government. The Franco-Italian wars waged between France and Spain break out. They continue for 25 years, having for their cause the claim of Charles VIII to the throne of Naples. In these conflicts, the Italians range themselves alternately with the Spaniards and with the French. Alternately. In these conflicts, the Italians range themselves alternately with the Spaniards and with the French. So, birth of Hans Sachs, November the 5th, most famous of the German Melster singers. 1595. After a year's campaign, Charles conquers Naples, but is forced to withdraw from Italy, owing to the league formed against him by the Pope and Ferdinand of Naples, who regains the Neapolitan crown. 1497, mainland of North America discovered by John Cabot. Vasco da Gama sails around the Cape Good Hope. 1498, Vasco da Gama finds an all-water route and arrives in India. Sebastian Cabot traces a part of the Atlantic coast of North America. Savonarola executed as a heretic at Florence, May 23rd. 1499, Amerigo Vespucci and Ojeda trace the eastern coast of South America, hence the name America, eventually given to both continents. The Swiss practically acknowledged as independent after war with Maximilian of Germany. In 1500 to the 1600 period of Renaissance in French literature, Réhil's Pantagruel 1533, Marat, Calvin, Amiot, Bodin, Montague, Essays 1580. In the 1500, you have Lodovico Forza regains Milan from the French, who had seized it a year before. Birth of Benny Benuto Cellini, Italian artist in metal and author, autobiography, died 1571. In 1501, the French, by Louis VII's conquest of Naples and with the aid of Ferdinand of Aragon, re-established their power in Italy. Caesar Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, gains dominion of Faenza, Rimini, and Pesaro with the title of Duke of Romagna. In 1502, we had war in Italy breaks out again between the French and Spaniards, resulting in the French being driven from Naples. In 1506, on the death of Philip I of Castile, Ferdinand assumes the rule as regent for Joan the Mad. Madagascar is discovered by Portuguese. Church of St. Peter at Rome begun on site of an ancient church, completed in 1590, dedicated 1626. In 1508, Maximilian of Germany, Pope Julius II, Louis VII of France, and Ferdinand of Aragon from the League of Cambrai against Venice. The Venetians are overcome at Agnadello, 1509. In 1511, Pope Julius II forms the Holy League for protection against France. In this Spain, Venice, and England under Henry VIII, who has married Catherine of Aragon, widow of his brother Arthur, and daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, are united against Louis VII. In 1512, the French, with a victory at Ravenna, April 11th, but are forced to withdraw from Lombardy. Sforza dynasty is restored in Milan. Ferdinand of Aragon conquers Spain, Navarre. The Medici regained their authority in Florence. In 1513, Henry VIII of England, with the aid of Maximilian of Germany, invades France. The French are overwhelmed in the Battle of the Spurs at Guinea Gate, August the 16th. Rouen and Tournai are taken by the English. Leo X Medici becomes a Renaissance pope. England is invaded by the Scots under James IV. Scots are defeated at Flodden Field, September the 9th, and James is killed. Queen Margaret becomes regent for her son, James V of Scotland. Balboa discovers the Pacific Ocean. So Niccolo Machiavelli writes The Prince, a classic in the history of political thought. In 1514, Henri VIII makes treaties of peace with Scotland and France. 1515, Francis I, succeeding Louis VII as King of France, marches into Italy and with the aid of the Venetians defeats the Swiss allies in Milan at Marignano, September 13th and 14th, thus breaking the prestigo of the Swiss infantry. He gains possession of Lombardy. Early in the next year, he establishes the perpetual peace with the Swiss and makes a concordat with Pope Leo X. From this time, Switzerland is a recruiting ground for the French army. In 1616, Sir Thomas More's Utopia, an account of an imaginary commonwealth, is published. New Testament in Greek published by Erasmus. So that is the New Testament of the Bible in Greek, published by Erasmus. That was in 1516. 1517, Leo X authorizes preaching of indulgences for the benefit of St. Peter's Church in Rome. In October, Martin Luther posts his 95 theses at, at Wittenberg, and the Reformation begins in Germany. In 1518, Zwingli begins the Swiss Reformation. This Martin Luther posts his 95 thesis. Is a real good document also to get to read. Martin Luther. In 1519, on the death of Maximilian of Germany, Charles I of Spain, his grandson, who is also the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella, is elected emperor, and Charles V as Charles V. Germany, Spain, the Netherlands, and Seychelles and Sardinia are thus joined under one sovereignty. Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese, makes a voyage for Spain through the straits separating Tierra del Fuego from Patagonia. 2 years later, he lands on the Ladrones and reaches the Philippines, March 1521, where he is killed. One of his ships, the Victoria, completes first circumnavigation of globe 1522. See ship table. In 1520, Francis I of Franco um, overthrows or entertained Henry VIII of England at a meeting on the field of the Cloth of Gold near Guineas. All right, and so we finished that part. So now we're on to part 5. So the World War period now from 1914 to 1919. Preliminaries 1912 to 1914 of the World War. The causes of the Great European Conflict, which broke out in 1914 and lasted till 1918, go back to the destruction of the Roman Empire in Central Europe and of the Greek Empire in Eastern Europe and Asia. The immediate occasion for this war was a conflict of races and nationalities in Central Europe, culminating in the local Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. One result of which was a rearrangement of the small Balkan states, races and nationalities. Austria, Hungary, and Serbia. Austria-Hungary, in order to exclude Serbia from access to the sea, brought about the establishment of the Albanian kingdom, which filled the Serbs with resentment. On the other hand, the Austrians were much chagrined by the Serbian victories over Turkey and Bulgaria, which enabled Serbia to double her territory and population by the Treaty of Bucharest. But the root of the Austro-Serbian quarrel was the Serbian desire to unite in one independent state the various branches of the Yugoslav race, Croats, Slovenes, and other groups, some millions of whom were subjects of Austria-Hungary. To this end, revolutionary secret societies were formed and an active propaganda was initiated, not only in Serbia but also in the Austro-Hungarian provinces, where the oppressive conditions of Austro-Hungarian rule made the population readily susceptible to agitation. Austria-Hungary regarded the Serbian ambition and tactics as dangerous to her integrity and had been watching for an opportunity to have a reckoning with the Serbian nation. Serbia, for her part, in the event of an Austro-Hungarian attack upon her, hoped for the assistance of Russia. On June 28, 1914, the Archduke Francis Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, was assassinated in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. Although the assassins were Austro-Hungarian subjects and natives of Bosnia, they were Serbians by race. Since the conspirators had secured their arms in Belgrade, the Serbian capital, the Austro-Hungarian government declared that the act was the result of Serbian propaganda and held the Serbian government morally responsible. Therefore, on July 23rd, Austria-Hungary presented to Serbia an ultimatum containing demands of such a character as had rarely been laid upon an independent state. The pan-Serbian propaganda must be suppressed. All anti-Austrian propaganda, whether in newspapers, textbooks, or schools, must cease. Officers in the government and army whose names the Austro-Hungarian government might submit must be removed. Serbia must accept Austro-Hungarian aid in the investigation of the murder. And finally, Serbia was required to accept the demands within 48 hours. It was believed at the time, and subsequent revelations leave no doubt as to the truth of this belief, that the ultimatum was so framed in order to precipitate war. On July 25th, 1914, Serbia practically accepted all the demands, save the one concerning an investigation of the outbreak, which she offered to arbitrate. These series of concessions did not satisfy Austria-Hungary, and on July 28, that state declared war against Serbia. Russia. This Balkan conflict speedily developed into a European war through the intervention of other great European powers, particularly Russia. Russia was unwilling to see Serbia crushed by Austria, partly because Russia had always posed as the protector of the Slav peoples of the Balkans, partly because the maintenance of Serbia was an important factor in her rivalry with the Teutonic powers throughout the Near East. The Russian government had tried, both by direct demand on Austria-Hungary and through appeal to Germany, to secure some modification of the ultimatum, but in vain. It accordingly replied to the Austro-Hungarian declaration of war against Serbia by ordering the mobilization of the southern military districts along the Austro-Hungarian frontier July 29th, hoping that this step would induce Austria-Hungary to negotiate. This concession Austria-Hungary refused. Moreover, the Russian General Staff regarded this partial and territorial limited mobilization as both impracticable and dangerous. The Tsar was therefore persuaded to order a general mobilization July 30th. Even at the risk of precipitating a European war, a danger which he sought to minimize by declaring that the Russian troops would not cross the frontier so long as negotiations continued. The Russian government refused to accept the assurances of Austria-Hungary that she did not covet Serbian territory or intend to destroy the independence of that little state. Post-war revelations have justified the Russian suspicions. For it is now known that Austria-Hungary intended to partition Serbia for the territorial enlargement of the neighboring countries of Bulgaria and Albania, and that plans were under consideration for deposing the Serbian king and bringing the country under the military and economic control of Austria-Hungary. Germany. So that was Russia. So Germany now. The Russian action in turn led to Germany intervention. From the point of view of Germany, she and her ally Austria-Hungary were in constant danger from the pan-Slavist ambitions of Russia, which seemed to threaten her own Kultur. Germany contended that she was being surrounded by an iron ring. On the east by Russia and her Balkan allies, on the west by France, the ally of Russia, and Great Britain. Another element in the controversy, which by this time was raging, was a consciousness of her material success and a pride in her efficient and scientific way of life. Hence, she demanded a position equal to what she considered her due, especially a more important position as a colonial power, a place in the sun. For her colonial empire was small compared with that of Great Britain and France, and her overseas possessions were less valuable and desirable than those of her rivals. The teachings of her philosophers emphasized that the basis of great states was might, and certain German writers argued that war was the proper means for the expansion of power and culture. For some years, too, the growth of the Socialist Party was considered a menace to the military regime in Germany, and the view prevailed in some circles that this rising political power could be repressed by a successful war. The General Staff, which was the center of German military power, for its part considered a war with Russia inevitable and believed that the longer it was delayed, the more favorable would be the military situation for Russia and her allies. The German government was also much alarmed by the disintegrating forces at work within the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, the effects of which might, however, so it was hoped, be checked if the Austro-Hungarian government adopted a vigorous foreign policy. Germany and Austro-Hungarian consultations. Before launching her ultimatum, Austria-Hungary consulted Germany, making clear that she proposed to go to war with Serbia. The German government sanctioned this program and promised support in case Russia interfered. When the ultimatum was issued, Germany accordingly gave scant encouragement to proposals of mediation and urged Austria-Hungary to declare war promptly in order to avoid unwelcome suggestions. But when it began to seem likely that Great Britain would be drawn into a general war, the German attitude changed somewhat. Austria-Hungary was advised to accept a British proposal that she should negotiate with the powers after occupying Belgrade, the Serbian capital. But the German pressure on Austria-Hungary was relaxed at the critical moment, probably because the military party in Berlin was anxious for war, and Austria-Hungary declined the British suggestion. German declaration of war upon Russia. At this moment, July 31st, the news of the Russian mobilization was received in Berlin, contending that mobilization meant war. Germany demanded that Russia cease mobilizing, and when Russia refused, declared war August 1st in order not to lose the advantage of her own speedier mobilization. Whatever military advantage was gained was offset politically, for Germany was placed in the position of aggressor in the eyes of France and Great Britain. Right. So France, Great Britain, Belgium, Italy, and the Balkan powers. France supported her ally, Russia, throughout the crisis, but advised caution in the matter of military preparation. In France's eyes, there was no alternative to a military settlement of the contest, otherwise the alliance would become valueless to Russia and Franco would be left isolated before a triumph on Germany. To the German inquiry about her intentions, however, Franco replied enigmatically that she would consult her interests August 1st. After the German declaration of war against Russia, France was bound, by her treaty with Russia, to take similar action against Germany. But not wishing to appear in the role of aggressor, she left the, the initiative to Germany, which finally issued a declaration of war on France August 3rd. Great Britain, which was not bound by treaty to France and Russia, endeavored to secure an extension of the time limit of the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum, urged that the Serbian reply be taken as a basis of negotiation, proposed a conference in London of the four powers most directly interested, and finally suggested that Austria-Hungary should content herself with the occupation of Belgrade while the powers negotiated a settlement with Serbia. All of these proposals were rejected by Austria-Hungary or Germany. The British cabinet was sharply divided in opinion as to the course to follow, intervention or neutrality. But the Prime Minister, Mr. Asquith, and the Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, were agreed that 1. Germany must not be allowed to crush France. 2. Because the French fleet had been concentrated in the Mediterranean by arrangement with the British Admiralty, a moral obligation existed for Great Britain to defend the northern coast of France against a German attack. Accordingly, on August 2nd, a promise was given to protect the northern coast of France, subject to the approval of Parliament, which was secured the following day. Meanwhile, the question of Belgian neutrality in the contest arose between France and Germany. France immediately replied that she would respect the neutrality of Belgium if Germany did so. The German answer was evasive in form and was soon followed by an ultimatum to Belgium requiring that country to allow the passage of the German army to the French frontier or take the consequences. The refusal of Belgium and the actual invasion of Belgian territory by the German armies August 3rd caused the wavering British cabinet and until then uncertain public opinion in England to turn sharply and immediately against Germany. On August 4th, Great Britain addressed an ultimatum. On August 4th, Great Britain addressed an ultimatum to Germany demanding that the neutrality of Belgium be respected, and on the refusal of the German government declared war at midnight. Italy, the other member of the Triple Alliance, issued a declaration of neutrality on the ground that she had not been consulted by her allies as required by the Treaty of Alliance in the steps which led to the war, and that the war was not one of defense against aggression, August 3rd. Likewise, Romania, which since 1883 had been the ally of the Central Powers, assumed an attitude of neutrality. The little kingdom of Montenegro promptly joined Serbia. Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey proclaimed their neutrality, although all were ultimately involved in the war. Indeed, Turkey signed a secret alliance with Germany on August 2nd. The attitude of the United States and Japan. The government of the United States offered its good offices, which were politely declined by all the belligerents. On August 15, Japan, the ally of Great Britain, presented an ultimatum to Germany requiring her to withdraw her fleet from far eastern waters and to surrender the leased territory of Kiaochoi, Shantung, to Japan. The German government made no answer, and on August 23, Japan declared war on Germany. In 1914, each government sought to convince its own people and neutrals that it was not responsible for the great catastrophe, and the effort was generally successful. Germany's actions, however, soon alienated the sympathy of a large part of the neutral world. The admission of the German Chancellor that the violation of Belgian neutrality, which had been granted by a treaty of 1831 signed by Germany, was a wrong, and his assertion that just for a word, neutrality, just for a scrap of paper, Great Britain was going to make war on a kindred nation, were interpreted as a cynical disregard for international law and the rights of small nations. The heroic resistance of the Belgian army to the invasion of their territory The sacking and burning of towns and villages along the route of the German advance, especially the destruction of Louvain and the adoption of a systematic policy of terrorization carried on in the hope of breaking the Belgian spirit, won the sympathy of the world for Belgium and gained for Germany opprobrium, an opprobrium outside the contending participants in the war, which proved a serious disadvantage throughout the war. Chronology, general and diplomatic. So other events pertaining to the war of interest, especially with reference to particular nations, will be found in the histories and chronologies of the nations involved. 1914, June 28th. So Archduke Francis Ferdinand, heir to Austrian throne and wife, assassinated at Sarajevo, Bosnia by Bosnian Serbs. Austria holds Serbia morally responsible. So they were assassinating uh, kings and queens and heirs to the throne. Remember back then it was a monarchy, right? So if we know how the rulers normally go, you know, you have monarchy, then you have republics, then you have dictatorship, then you have democracy, then you have dictatorship, then sometime back to monarchy is like a cycle. So back then they were eliminating those monarchies. So July 5th, the German Emperor William II receives a letter from the Emperor Francis Joseph and a memorandum from Berthold, the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister. These documents outline a plan for the isolation and diminution of Serbia by means of an alliance with Bulgaria and pressure on Romania, and declared that a friendly settlement with Serbia is no longer to be thought of, the Austro-Hungarian ambassador explains. Right, so it would have stopped there. Remember I told you guys that even though it is the read, it's still not the full complete read running from page to page, right? So we jump to 1919 continued. So cession of British Indian opinion, partly because the Allies did not know what else to do with the city, right? So we just continue. We just continue on 1919, yeah, right? So the Straits of Bosporus and the Dardanelles were, however, declared open at all times and placed under international control. Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia, and Arabia were detached from Turkey, the first three to be set up as mandatory areas under the League of Nations. Armenia was declared an independent state, and Kurdistan was promised autonomy. Greece was to receive the district around Smyrna. Turkey was to consist of what was left of the former holdings in Asia Minor. In addition, drastic limitations were included for the control of the Turkish government and of the economic life of the state. This treaty, signed by the government at Constantinople, was repudiated by the revolutionary government which had established itself in Angora. It was never ratified and was eventually, as a result of the Greco-Turkish War of 1920-22, replaced by the Treaty of Lausanne, 1923. Unsettled problems, 1919. Throughout Eastern and Southeastern Europe, the lines of demarcation between the various races and peoples are seldom clear-cut or distinct, so that however the political frontiers are drawn, it is almost impossible to avoid placing some race groups under alien rule. The number of such racial minorities had been very large before the war. The result of the war was in many cases to reduce to the position of minorities those who had enjoyed hitherto political, economic, and social ascendancy, and the new masters had many scores to pay off. Accordingly, the Allied powers compelled Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, and Greece to accept minorities treaties in which the civil, political, and religious rights of the minorities were solemnly recognized, and the protection of these rights was vested in the League of Nations. The succession states protested vainly against what they considered infringements of their national sovereignty, all the more so because the Allied powers refused to assume similar obligations and limitations for themselves. Two questions completely baffled the peace conference. The first was the disposition of Flume. This city, with a small majority of Italians, lay within territory occupied from time immemorial by Slavs and claimed by the new Serb, Croat, Slovene state Yugoslavia. So look, so Yugoslavia is a combination of Serbs, Croats, and Slovene. Italy demanded flew, but the peace conference, acting upon the suggestion of President Wilson, refused to accede to this demand. It was seized by an unauthorized force of Italian troops and held for many months. The question was settled, that is a coup, right? The question was settled by direct negotiation between Italy and Yugoslavia, who agreed by the Treaty of Rapallo or Rapallo, November 12, 1920, that Fiume should become an independent state. A later arrangement provided for the annexation of Fiume to Italy, in return for which part of the harbor was assigned to Yugoslavia. The second problem which defied solution was the question of Russia. Not only had the empire disintegrated and certain portions such as Finland and Poland been recognized as independent states by the Allies, but the Russian government had fallen into the hands of the Bolshevik, with whom no power was willing to treat. France, England, and the United States and Japan still had troops in her territory and were at war with the Bolshevist government, especially on the Pacific coast where American troops had occupied Vladiv Vladivostok. Various proposals were made looking to the settlement of this question, but no solution was reached. In the end, the Allied powers themselves, refusing to recognize the Bolshevist government, left it to the various states which had been established along the western border of the old empire to make their own terms with Soviet Russia. The work of the peace conference has for 10 years been much criticized on the ground that it effected the, the, bal, the balkanization of Europe. That is to say, it set up a large number of small states whose economic foundations were precarious, and it disturbed the channels of commerce which had been developed in pre-war days. The criticism is largely justified. Practically all of these states had established or re-established themselves by the time of the peace by the time the peace conference met. The task of the conference was to determine the frontiers between the nations. The frontiers drawn were not perfect and could certainly be improved upon certainly be improved upon could certainly be improved upon at certain points. But the hopelessly confusing mixture of peoples makes perfect frontiers out of the question. For all the imperfections of detail, the new map of Europe, based on a frank recognition of the principle of nationality, is a vast improvement on that of 1940. An important result is that the number of racial minorities has been greatly reduced. The economic difficulties of post-war Europe have also not has also not so much from the new frontiers as from the spirit of nationalism, which has led nearly every state to surround herself with high and ever higher tariff walls. Since then, they're increasing tariffs, right? Because they want states to create their own food, plant their own food, create their own products to sustain their nations, right? From the political point of view, the problem of the frontiers is seemingly insoluble. Certainly between the wish of the defeated powers to modify the territorial settlement of 1919 to 20 and the determination of the victors to retain what they have secured, there is no obvious compromise and hence no prospect of enduring peace. Other readjustments, 1920, 1922. So although in general the treaties of peace determined the new frontiers, plebiscites were provided for in several instances, and these were carried out in 1920 to 1921. In the case of the southern boundary of East Prussia, the vote was so overwhelmingly in favor of Germany that the claims of Poland were not recognized by the Allies and the old boundary was not changed. In Schleswig, the vote followed closely the line of racial cleavage, and the province was divided between Denmark and Germany. In Kiagenfurt, contested between Austria and Yugoslavia, economic interests apparently prevailed over racial sympathies, for Austria got the larger vote and was allowed to keep the entire territory. Hungary tried to resist the transfer of Burgenland to Austria, and irregular troops succeeded in seizing the town of Oldenburg's Sopron. A plebiscite was held late in 1921, which gave a vote in favor of Hungary, and she was permitted to keep the town. The Silesian question was not so easily settled. By the terms of the treaty, the Supreme Council was to divide Upper Silesia on the basis of a plebiscite. When this resulted in an overwhelming vote in favor of Germany, irregular Polish troops occupied the districts which had given a majority in favor of Poland. This brought about a collision with Germany irregulars. France espoused the side of Poland while England who was anxious to restore prosperity in Germany, sought to retain the main industrial districts of Germany. Through the mediation of the League of Nations, a compromise was finally reached by which Germany was deprived of some of the richest mineral districts. A convention between Germany and Poland in 1922 provided for maintaining the economic unity of the industrial region for a period of 15 years. In the Near East, the Serbs Treaty, see Turkey 1920, May 11, proved unenforceable. Although consented to and signed by the Turkish government, it was not observed by the Turkish nationalists, who fought with varying success against the Greeks. Unfortunately for the Greeks, the Allies did not maintain a united front. In October 1921, France, by a secret agreement, consented to withdraw from Cilicia to return in return for economic concessions. See Turkey 1921, October 2022. And in March 1922, Italy likewise secretly pledged herself to support the Turkish demand for the restitution of Thrace and Smyrna and withdrew her troops from Turkish territory in return for economic concessions. Thus, Greece was left to bear the brunt of the struggle, with such moral support as she could get from England. In the final campaign, the Greeks were at first successful, but their time was finally broken, and they were driven back to Smyrna, which had to be evacuated and was then burned by the Turks. War was narrowly avoided between the victorious Turks and the allied garrisons at the Straits and Constantinople, but an armistice was signed on October 11, 1922. All right, so we're gonna stop there and we're gonna take up the chronology, the peace conference 1919, negotiations and treaties on the next read, right? All right, guys. So thank you guys for your time, your patience. All right. Remember, strengthen body, powers, and mind. Stay up.